The first time I twisted the shut-off valve in daylight, I did it with a kind of theatrical calm. Saturday morning, sun already warming the shingles, birds chattering as if they had front-row tickets. I crouched in the narrow strip behind my hedge, hidden from the street, and gave the handle a slow, deliberate turn. The vibration of water halted with a faint shudder that traveled up the pipe, like the last exhale of a dying animal. And then silence. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler head sputtered twice, then stopped, leaving a half-moon of wet grass and a dry circle in the center. I dusted my hands and went back to my coffee. The neighborhood didn't notice immediately. At first, the only hint was that the usual chorus of whirring sprinklers wasn't present during the morning jogger parade. By noon, though, the questions began to rise. I overheard Barbara's husband talking loudly into his phone on the sidewalk, cursing about low pressure. 2 doors down, a family dragged their laundry baskets back inside after discovering the washer wouldn't fill. And by evening, Barbara herself was knocking on my front door with the fake urgency of someone pretending to be concerned for the whole community. "Did you notice the water pressure?" she asked, eyes darting over my shoulder as though she might catch me hiding a full reservoir in my kitchen. "Several homes are reporting issues. It could be a main break." I leaned casually against the doorframe, mug in hand. "Oh yeah, mine's fine. Shower worked great this morning. Maybe it's localized." That threw her. For a moment, her lips pinched into a line, then she recovered. "We'll be contacting the city. This could be serious." "Good idea," I said cheerfully. "Always best to go through the proper channels." I watched her walk away, spine stiff as a ruler, and shut the door with a quiet laugh. By Sunday afternoon, the cul-de-sac looked like a desert. Lawns that had been green and smugly manicured were starting to crisp at the edges. Sprinklers sat useless in the grass like dead insects. Children wandered around with plastic water guns that sputtered empty. And still, nobody suspected me. The water company trucks rolled in, men in reflective vests clanking pipes and scratching their heads. I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea, looking as innocent as a man could. They checked valves, opened manholes, and after an hour drove away shaking their heads. That evening, Barbara convened an emergency HOA meeting at her driveway, folding chairs neatly arranged like a courtroom. Half the block showed up, waving bills, muttering about ruined laundry, dry showers, dying flowerbed. I listened from my porch as if eavesdropping were a spectator sport. The consensus was outrage, of course, but outrage needs a target. And when no target is obvious, people manufacture one. Barbara stood, clipboard in hand, her voice pitched high enough to carry. "This is not acceptable. We cannot live without reliable utilities. Someone is responsible. If the city won't solve it, we will escalate." A neighbor piped up, "Maybe it's construction damage?" Another shook his head. "No digging crews nearby." Then Barbara's eyes flicked toward my house, and I could almost hear the thought forming before she said it. "It's peculiar, isn't it? That one property hasn't reported any issues." Dozens of heads swiveled. I raised my glass in a lazy salute, feigning surprise at the attention. "You haven't noticed anything?" Barbara called out. "Nope," I said. "Plenty of water here. Maybe you folks just need newer pipes." That sent a ripple through the crowd, some laughter, some muttering. Barbara bristled, but she wasn't ready to accuse me openly. Not yet. She needed proof. Proof she'd never get. The beauty of my position was in its deniability. The easement line was old, buried in paperwork no one bothered to read. Even if they dragged out maps, the control point was on my land, which meant I could turn the spigot of their lives off and on like a DJ spinning record. And I intended to play a very long set. By Monday morning, the HOA group chat was in full meltdown. I know because my neighbor Carl, who couldn't keep a secret if you stapled his lips shut, showed me screenshots. People were accusing the water company of negligence, accusing Barbara of mishandling dues, accusing each other of wasting water. Friendships frayed over whose lawn looked worst. It was beautiful chaos. But then came the twist I half expected and half dreaded. Barbara showed up at my door again, this time flanked by 2 board members, all carrying notepads like they were on an inspection tour. "We need to check your property," she said briskly. "If you're the only one with normal water, there could be a leak or an illegal tap." I sipped my coffee. Illegal tap? That's a serious accusation. "We're not accusing," one of the men said quickly, sweat already gathering on his forehead. "We just want to rule things out." "Tell you what," I said. "Come back with a warrant or the city inspector. Until then, my property's private. You know the rules." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "If you're hiding something, we will find out." I smiled, wide and calm. "Hide? No. But I do like my privacy. You understand." They left frustrated, scribbling notes they probably hoped would sound official later. I watched them march down the sidewalk, and for the first time in weeks, I felt lighter. They had poisoned my hedge, destroyed something I'd nurtured for years, and assumed I'd fold. Instead, I was tightening the leash around their throats, one dry faucet at a time. By Wednesday, the neighborhood was fracturing. Some residents hauled buckets from a nearby park spigot. Others drove to friends' houses to shower. Cars lined the street as people loaded up on bottled water. And then came the inevitable. Barbara tried to enforce lawn fines despite the drought, mailing notices that grass had to remain green and presentable. The hypocrisy would have been laughable if it weren't so pathetic. Neighbors who once worshipped her order started turning on her. One evening, as I walked out to retrieve my mail, Carl leaned over his fence and whispered, "People are blaming her. They think she's mishandled funds. They're talking about voting her out." "Is that so?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He nodded eagerly. "They're furious. Some even think she's the reason the water's gone. You couldn't have planned it better." I chuckled softly. "Sometimes, Carl, things just line up." But even as the cracks spread, Barbara grew more desperate. She started patrolling at night with a flashlight, peering into yards, probably hoping to catch someone red-handed siphoning water. I made sure my hose dripped occasionally, just enough to look mundane. When she passed by, I waved. Her face twisted like she'd swallowed vinegar. By the end of the week, the city water department sent a notice. No infrastructure problems detected, all lines operational. Translation: the problem was local, confined to us, and that left only one conclusion for the HOA to draw, that someone in the neighborhood was responsible. But suspicion is poison. It doesn't need proof, only time. By starving them of water, I'd turned them against each other. And Barbara, with her smug arrogance and power-hungry grip, was the easiest target. Still, I knew she wouldn't give up. A woman like Barbara doesn't just lose quietly. She would double down, escalate, dig her nails into control until they broke. And when she did, I'd be ready. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about teaching her a lesson she'd never forget. You don't poison a man's hedge and walk away unscathed. The hedge was gone now, brown skeletons cut down to stump. But in its absence, I had discovered something far more satisfying than greenery. I had leverage. And leverage, in the right hands, is worth more than water, more than rules, more than any HOA title could ever give. So when Barbara stood at the end of the street on Friday evening, shouting into her phone about emergency measures and consulting a lawyer, I just sat on my porch, sipping iced tea, and waited for the moment her empire finally cracked. Because the water wasn't coming back. Not until I decided the lesson had sunk deep enough to last. And something told me we were only getting started. By the second week without water, the cul-de-sac looked less like a neighborhood and more like a movie set for some post-apocalyptic survival drama. Lawns that once gleamed emerald under strict HOA care had browned to brittle husk. Hanging baskets wilted like damp paper. Even the ornamental fountains, which Barbara loved to tout as symbols of neighborhood class, sat dry, their stone bowls gathering dust and mosquitoes. People who once boasted about their irrigation systems were now carting gallon jugs home from Costco like refugees. I'd sit on my porch each evening with a cold drink, listening to the growing chorus of complaints drifting down the block. Barbara was unraveling. At first, she had clung to her usual tone of superiority, sending out carefully worded emails blaming the water company, promising resolution, urging patience and unity. But by the 10th day, her composure was gone. She stomped from house to house with her clipboard, demanding updates, accusing residents of hoarding, threatening fines for unsightly lawns that everyone knew couldn't be watered. The hypocrisy burned through whatever goodwill she still had. For the first time, I saw neighbors rolling their eyes when she walked by, muttering under their breath. The Queen of Elmwood Lane was losing her subjects. But Barbara wasn't a quitter. She pivoted. When intimidation failed, she shifted to theatric. At a hastily called HOA meeting, this one at her living room since her driveway speeches no longer drew more than a handful, she unveiled her newest theory: sabotage. Someone, she declared, was deliberately disrupting the water supply. She spoke with the conviction of a true believer, eyes wide, voice rising. "This is an act of vandalism against our community," she proclaimed. "A personal attack on every one of us." The board members nodded nervously, though I could see doubt in their faces. Barbara's husband chimed in about outside agitators and suggested installing security cameras on every street corner. It would have been comical if it weren't so desperate. They were flailing, trying to point fingers outward when the real fracture lines were right under their noses. Then came the first real retaliation. One night, just past midnight, I woke to the faint hiss of a spray can outside my window. I crept quietly to the blinds and peeked out. Two figures in hoodies crouched at my hedge stumps, shaking cans of neon paint. By the time I stepped outside, hands in my pockets and voice calm, they had scrawled "Hoarder" across my fence in dripping orange letters. "Gentlemen," I said softly, startling them so badly one dropped the can. They froze like kids caught stealing candy. "You've got the wrong idea," I continued, my tone casual, almost friendly. "But I'll let you keep your secret. Just remember, what goes around comes around." They bolted down the street, leaving the paint cans behind. I didn't chase. I didn't need to. Fear works better when it's quiet. By morning, the graffiti stood like a billboard of their desperation, and I left it up for a full day before calmly painting it over. Let them stew. Let them wonder why I didn't scream or call the police. Silence unnerves more than shouting. Meanwhile, the water company was being hounded daily. Trucks rolled in and out, inspectors walking the cul-de-sac with puzzled expressions. Barbara marched beside them, arms crossed, as though sheer willpower could force the ground to confess. But of course, nothing showed. The infrastructure was fine. No leaks, no breaks, no blockages. The mystery gnawed at her. I saw it in her face, the way her eyes lingered on my property just a beat too long, the way her smile tightened when I waved. She suspected me, but suspicion without evidence is just gossip. And gossip can cut both ways. On the 12th day, I decided to twist the knife. I turned the valve partially back on, just enough to give the neighborhood a teasing trickle. Sprinklers hissed weakly, faucets sputtered, showers dribbled. People rejoiced, thinking the crisis was over. Barbara sent out a triumphant email crediting the HOA's persistence. The relief was palpable. But within 24 hours, I shut it down again. Dead silence returned, and the joy turned to fury. Neighbors who had praised Barbara for solving the issue now cursed her name. It was a cruel little dance, and I led every step. By the weekend, the block was in open rebellion. At another meeting, this time on Carl's lawn, since Barbara's gatherings were now boycotted, voices rose in anger. "You promised results," one man shouted. "My kids haven't had a decent shower in 2 weeks." Another woman yelled, "Our bills are the same, but we're not getting water. Where's the money going?" Barbara tried to shout them down, her voice cracking, sweat streaking her foundation. But the crowd was done listening. Someone suggested voting to suspend the HOA's authority until the water was restored. That was treason in Barbara's eyes. She shrieked about bylaws, about order, about responsibility. But the harder she clung, the faster they slipped away. And then, in a moment almost too perfect, Carl raised his hand and said loudly, "Maybe the problem isn't the city. Maybe the problem is right here on this street." Every head turned. Silence fell. Barbara paled. Carl glanced toward my house, then looked away quickly, as if afraid to make eye contact. "I'm just saying, if one property never lost water, maybe that's where we should be looking." The implication hung in the air like smoke. I stayed on my porch, calm as stone, sipping tea. I didn't flinch, didn't speak. Let them stew. Let Barbara squirm. Because here was the beauty. Carl's words had split the group in half. Some immediately latched onto the idea that I was guilty, muttering darkly about illegal taps. Others, sick of Barbara's arrogance, saw it as a convenient excuse to blame her instead, accusing her of covering something up, of scapegoating me to save herself. Neighbors argued in circles while I sat quietly, the puppet master no one could quite see. That night, Barbara tried one last gambit. I heard her outside my fence at nearly 2 a.m., whispering to her husband as he fiddled with something metal. I slipped silently out the back and watched from the shadows. They were trying to dig near the pipe, hoping to prove I had tampered with it. But they had no clue where the shut-off valve was buried, and after an hour of fruitless scraping, they gave up, sweaty and defeated. I almost pitied them. Almost. The next morning, I found a fresh violation notice taped to my door. Non-compliant yard maintenance, graffiti residue visible. Fine. $250. The pettiness made me laugh out loud. They were drowning on dry land, and still clinging to paperwork as if it gave them power. The first time I realized someone had poisoned my hedge, it was a Tuesday morning that already smelled of gasoline and bad coffee. I was sipping from my chipped mug, the one my ex left behind because she hated how heavy it was, when I noticed the neat line of leaves on my boxwood hedge had turned a sickly yellow overnight. It wasn't weather, it wasn't drought. The air still held the damp sweetness of last night's rain, the soil was dark and rich, but the hedge looked like it had been dipped in bleach. Half the neighborhood walks past my front yard each day, so I knew within hours the gossip would spread like wildfire. "Did you see his hedge? The pride of Elmwood Lane is rotting." And sure enough, by the time I stepped out to inspect, the first wave of whispers was already drifting down the sidewalk. The hedge wasn't just ornamental. It was my boundary line, my subtle wall of green privacy against the invasive eyes of the HOA. They hated it precisely because it was taller than regulation height, dense enough to block their sidelines, and stubbornly alive despite their constant fines and letters threatening action. I trimmed it religiously, never once letting it grow higher than the exact measurement listed in their pamphlet, yet they still called it non-compliant. That morning I could feel the malice humming off the leaf. Someone had poured something into the soil. Something deliberate. Something final. And I didn't need to guess too hard who. Right on cue, Barbara, chairwoman of the HOA, queen of clipped cardigans and faux sympathy, approached with her morning walk group. She slowed her pace just enough to let her eyes slide over the ruined hedge. Her lips twisted in what could only be described as a smile if you were feeling generous. "Oh no," she said in a sing-song voice. "What happened here? Looks diseased. Terrible shame. You might want to pull it all out before it spreads to other yards." Her friends nodded, a chorus of smug pity. I thanked her through gritted teeth, mug raised in mock salute, and she moved on, leaving the faint smell of lavender lotion and victory behind. That was the first jab. And the thing about jabs is that they're not meant to kill. They're meant to test how much you'll tolerate. I spent the next day digging around the roots, my gloves caked with foul-smelling soil that reeked of chemicals. I knew my plants, and this wasn't rot or fungus. It was poison. Someone had poured herbicide in a straight, deliberate line. The precision was almost surgical. Whoever did it wanted me to know. I could have called the police, but the HOA had the local cop in their pocket. Her husband sat on their board. Any complaint would be filed, dismissed, and passed around at their next meeting like a joke. So instead, I watered what I could save, clipped what I couldn't, and waited. That Friday evening, as I dragged my trash bins out, I saw the second move. The HOA had taped a notice directly onto my front door in bold, officious lettering. Immediate compliance required. Remove dead hedge. Replacement shrubs must conform to HOA standards. Deadline: 14 days. I laughed out loud, the kind of laugh you only hear in bars at midnight when someone's about to throw a punch. They weren't just trying to kill my hedge. They were trying to erase it, replace it with something they approved, something short and pathetic that wouldn't block their line of sight. It wasn't about plants. It was about control. The hedge was symbolic. My refusal to bow was symbolic. This was war. And wars are won not by reacting, but by setting the field. That night, I sat in my garage surrounded by tools, jotting notes like a general. I wasn't going to play their game by pleading or filing appeals. No, I was going to remind them how fragile their little empire actually was. My property had something their entire HOA couldn't function without: water. Half the houses in our cul-de-sac tapped into an easement line that ran under my back fence. It was a decades-old arrangement from when my land had been subdivided. Nobody liked to acknowledge it, but the easement gave me rights. Rights they assumed I'd never use. They were wrong. The next morning, Barbara stopped by again, this time pretending it was casual. She commented on the weather, then slipped in, "If you need help picking compliant shrubs, we can recommend a few nurseries." Her eyes sparkled with mock kindness. I smiled back, thanked her, and told her I already had something in mind. She left satisfied, no doubt thinking she'd finally forced my surrender. What she didn't know was that I'd already called the water company, already researched every legal clause tied to that easement, already planned the first step of my retaliation. Cutting their water wouldn't just be revenge. It would be education. A reminder of who actually held power when the ground beneath their feet belonged to someone else. But I wasn't stupid. You don't cut off water to an entire neighborhood without expecting an explosion. I had to make it look natural, believable, something they couldn't pin directly on me. So I spent the next few days casually working in the yard, making sure every neighbor saw me with spades, pipes, and wrenches. When Barbara strolled past and asked if I was fixing my irrigation, I nodded and let her believe I was just a homeowner struggling to keep his grass alive. The truth was, I had already installed a series of hidden shutoff valves inside my property line. With a single twist, I could reduce their water flow to a trickle. And with another twist, cut it entirely. I tested it one night, watching from my darkened window as sprinklers in 3 yards sputtered weakly before coughing to silence. It worked perfectly. When I turned the valve back on, I knew I was holding their leash. The power felt electric, humming in my hands. My hedge was dying, but my patience was not. They wanted control, they wanted submission, they wanted to parade my defeat down the sidewalk. Instead, I was about to introduce them to thirst. Real thirst. The kind that makes tempers short and exposes the cracks in a community's perfect facade. The hedge was just the beginning. They had no idea what storm was brewing. And as I sipped my coffee the next morning, staring at the yellowing leaves, I smiled. Because if they thought killing my hedge was their victory, they hadn't yet realized what it had cost them. But I wasn't done. Oh no. Poisoning my hedge had been their first mistake. Believing they controlled me was their second. Now I intended to deliver the lesson that would end Barbara's reign once and for all. The water shortage had primed the neighborhood against her, but to truly finish her off, I needed one last push. Something undeniable. Something public. So I began planning. Carefully, quietly, like a man sharpening a blade in the dark. The next phase wouldn't just dry out lawns or crack tempers. It would expose Barbara for the fraud she was. And when that happened, not even her beloved bylaws could save her. For now, I waited, calm and patient, sipping coffee on my porch while the neighborhood simmered in thirst and suspicion. Every day that passed, the hedge stumps in my yard reminded me, revenge, like plants, grows best when watered slowly. And I still held the valve. The turning point came on the 15th day, though I didn't realize it until later. By then, the neighborhood had devolved into factions. On one side were the die-hard loyalists who still clung to Barbara's authority like a security blanket, convinced she was the only one who could restore order. On the other side were the disillusioned residents who had finally seen through her pretense and wanted blood. Between them was a growing group who didn't care about politics. They just wanted to shower and water their kids without hauling buckets from the park. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came when Barbara decided to take matters into her own hands. Early Saturday morning, I heard the whine of power tools from the easement strip behind my yard. I slipped quietly into my garage, peered through a narrow vent, and saw her husband kneeling in the dirt with a rented drill rig while Barbara supervised, arms crossed and face pinched like a hawk. They were digging straight down, convinced they'd find the illegal tap she had invented in her mind. I watched for nearly an hour, amused, as they struggled with clay soil and tangled roots. They were sweating, cursing, covered in mud, but they didn't find anything. Because of course they wouldn't. I had buried my shut-off valves deeper and disguised them with utility markers from a salvage yard, perfect camouflage. Still, their persistence was dangerous. The more they dug, the more chance they had of stumbling too close. Finally, I stepped outside, moving slow, mug in hand. "Morning," I called cheerfully. "Productive day?" Barbara nearly jumped out of her skin. "We're investigating," she snapped. "On my property?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's community land," she shot back. "Easement rights." "Ah yes," I said. "Easement rights. Fascinating little legal concept. You should be careful though. Easements cut both ways. They give access, sure, but they also protect the original property owner." Her husband muttered something and began gathering his tools. Barbara glared at me like I'd spoiled her game, which of course I had. "We'll be back," she hissed, as if promising retribution. "Bring a lawyer," I replied pleasantly, and went back inside. By the afternoon, word of Barbara's little excavation attempt had spread. Neighbors were furious, not at me, but at her. She hadn't asked permission, hadn't notified anyone, just grabbed her husband and started digging. One resident shouted at her in the street about trespassing. Another accused her of abusing HOA funds to rent equipment. Barbara tried to spin it as protecting the community, but her credibility was unraveling faster than her manicure. I decided it was time to escalate. That night, under cover of darkness, I partially opened the valve again. Not enough to restore normal pressure, but just enough to make things unpredictable. Some houses got water in the morning but none by evening. Sprinklers sprayed weakly for 20 minutes, then died. Toilets half flushed. It was chaos, the kind that drives people mad because it feels intentional. And of course it was. By Sunday, the neighborhood was a circus. People ran hoses into buckets during the brief windows of flow, then hoarded the water like gold. Tempers flared. One man nearly came to blows with his neighbor for filling a kiddie pool. Someone reported theft of resources to the police, who showed up, shrugged, and left, clearly uninterested in mediating suburban squabbles. Meanwhile, Barbara doubled down, plastering notices on every door warning that water misuse would result in fines. That was the final straw for many. Fining residents for not watering their lawns was one thing, but fining them for using water when they had it? Outrageous. The rebellion went from whispers to open mutiny. Carl told me half the block was drafting a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. I listened with polite interest, hiding my satisfaction. The plan was working better than I'd dared hope. Still, Barbara wasn't finished. Cornered animals lash out, and she was nothing if not cornered. On Monday morning, she marched to my porch with a stack of papers. "We're taking legal action," she announced, thrusting the stack toward me. "You've interfered with community utilities. This will not stand." I took the papers, leafed through them, and nearly laughed. They were nothing but printed bylaws and highlighted passages, dressed up to look like a lawsuit. Not a single official stamp, not a single attorney's signature. Pure theater. Compelling reading, I said, handing them back. But next time, Barbara, use real stationery. It makes the bluff more convincing. Her face went crimson. You think this is a game? Of course, I said softly. And I'm winning. She stormed off, shaking, and I knew then she'd try something reckless. Sure enough, that night I caught her sneaking back with a flashlight. This time she wasn't digging, she was photographing. My fence, my yard, my utility boxes. She was desperate to gather evidence of wrongdoing. I stood silently on my porch until she realized I was watching. When our eyes met, she froze, then quickly walked away without a word. The fear in her posture was unmistakable. The next day, the neighborhood exploded. Not literally, but socially. Someone had leaked screenshots of HOA financials, payments, reimbursements, Barbara's personal expenses coded as community improvements. It wasn't me, though I had my suspicions about which disgruntled board member had grown tired of her. The effect was nuclear. Residents gathered in groups on the street, waving the printouts, shouting accusations. Barbara tried to deny it, then tried to justify it, but the damage was done. Her empire was crumbling. And I stayed quiet, watching from my porch, the calm eye of the storm. My plan had always been slow pressure, patient escalation, and now the cracks were spreading on their own. I didn't need to speak. The neighborhood was doing my work for me. That evening, Carl stopped by, looking nervous. They're calling for a vote, he whispered. Emergency meeting tomorrow. They might actually kick her out. I sipped my coffee and nodded. About time. But what if she blames you? He asked. I smiled. She already does. But blame without proof is just noise. And Barbara's noise is getting drowned out. The next day was glorious. The meeting was held on the cul-de-sac itself, lawn chairs and folding tables set up like a tribunal. Nearly every resident attended, angry and determined. Barbara stood at the center, defiant, shouting about loyalty and betrayal, about bylaws and order. But when the vote was called, the result was clear. She was removed as HOA chair by overwhelming majority. Her face when the numbers were announced was something I'll never forget. Shock, fury, disbelief, all wrapped into one mask of defeat. But even dethroned, Barbara wasn't finished. She screamed about illegal sabotage, about conspiracies, about enemies in their midst. And when her eyes landed on me, she pointed with a trembling finger. It's him, she shrieked. He's behind it. He's stolen your water. He's laughing at all of you. The crowd turned. Dozens of eyes fixed on me. The silence was heavy. I stood slowly, set down my mug, and walked to the center. Barbara, I said calmly, you've accused me of a lot these past weeks. You've dug in my yard, photographed my property, spread lies. And yet, after all that, you still have no proof. Just your word. And given your recent financial revelations, I'm not sure your word carries much weight. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded. Others glared at Barbara. She sputtered, tried to shout again, but the momentum was gone. Her accusations sounded hollow, desperate. The vote had stripped her of power. My silence had stripped her of credibility. And the water valve, still firmly in my control, meant I held the real power whether they knew it or not. As the meeting dissolved into arguments and Barbara stormed home, I walked back to my porch, calm and unhurried. The hedge was long dead, but I felt a strange satisfaction. The lesson wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. Barbara still thought she could fight me. And I was going to show her just how wrong she was. Because cutting off their water had been phase 1. Exposing Barbara's corruption had been phase 2. And phase 3? That would be the endgame. Barbara's downfall should have ended things. Rationally, losing her crown, her clipboard, and the fragile loyalty of the neighbors should have driven her into quiet retreat. But people like Barbara don't retire gracefully. They claw, scratch, and thrash until someone drags them out of the spotlight. I knew the dethroning was only the midpoint. The real battle was still ahead. The day after the vote, I found a new notice taped to my mailbox. Not HOA branded this time, but handwritten in angry block letters. "We know it's you. Give us our water back." The words were jagged, smeared like the pen had been pressed too hard. I stood there in the morning sun, sipping coffee, reading it like a piece of abstract art. Fear was spreading, but fear without direction always searches for the nearest target. By evening, 3 neighbors had confronted me separately. One asked politely if I'd noticed anything strange with my water. Another leaned over my fence with suspicion heavy in his voice. "Funny how your lawn still looks okay." And the last one, a man who barely knew my name, simply barked, "If you're screwing with us, knock it off." I answered each with the same calm smile, the same half-shrug of innocence. "No problems here. Must be the city." The beauty of my position was that I never had to lie outright, I just had to let their assumptions do the work. But Barbara wasn't content to let paranoia simmer. She needed a stage. Stripped of her title, she began hosting community updates on her porch, ranting to anyone who would listen. She claimed the vote was rigged, the financial leaks were fake, the bylaws had been misinterpreted. And always, she returned to me. "He's the common denominator," she told her shrinking audience. "He's mocking us. He's the reason we're suffering." I played my part perfectly. Calm. Detached. A man above the fray. I trimmed what was left of my hedge stumps, watered the surviving shrubs, waved pleasantly at passers-by. Every act of normalcy was gasoline on Barbara's fire. She wanted me frantic, defensive, guilty-looking. Instead, I looked untouchable. And then came her first truly reckless move. One night, just after midnight, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Peeking through the blinds, I saw Barbara and 2 of her allies unloading cases of bottled water from her SUV. They stacked them on her lawn like relief rations, handing them out the next morning as though she were some benevolent savior. Neighbors lined up with gratitude, desperate for even a temporary fix. Barbara basked in it, chin lifted, smile plastered on like it was still election day. I almost admired the audacity. Almost. But desperation always has a cost. Those cases weren't free. Within days, whispers spread that she had charged the purchases to the HOA credit card one last time before being locked out of the account. The rebellion reignited with twice the fury. The bottles, once symbols of relief, became evidence of theft. Neighbors who had thanked her now cursed her name for stealing their own dues to buy water she pretended to donate. I decided it was time to tip the scales. That evening, I opened the valve wide for just 3 hours. Long enough for faucets to run strong, showers to roar, sprinklers to arc triumphantly across lawns. Neighbors cheered, posting on the group chat that the crisis was finally over. Some even credited Barbara's leadership, though others called it dumb luck. And then, at midnight, I shut it all off again. The fury was nuclear. By dawn, people were pounding on Barbara's door demanding explanations. She swore she'd fixed it, that her pressure campaign on the city had forced result. But when the taps went dry again, her credibility shattered into dust. People shouted in her yard, cursed her name, threatened lawsuit. She slammed her door, curtains drawn, while her husband barked at the crowd to leave. By now, the cul-de-sac looked less like a suburban paradise and more like a war zone. Lawns were dead. Tempers flared daily. Someone scrawled "liar" on Barbara's garage door in red spray paint. Another resident ripped down her porch, update bulletins, and burned them in the street. The HOA board officially dissolved, resigning en masse in an email that dripped with exhaustion. And still, through it all, Barbara's obsession with me grew. She lingered near my yard, stared at my hose bib, snapped photos when she thought I wasn't looking. Once, she even shouted across the street, "You're the devil in this neighborhood." I raised my mug in a lazy salute, which only sent her storming inside. The tension reached its peak on the 20th day. That morning, the water pressure sputtered and died as usual. Neighbors were outside, sweaty and furious, when Barbara marched onto the cul-de-sac with a bullhorn. Yes, a bullhorn. She had purchased it from somewhere, probably online, and now stood in the center of the street barking accusations. "This man is responsible," she screamed, pointing directly at my porch. "He has sabotaged us. He has stolen what belongs to all of us. And you cowards let him sit there, mocking us while we suffer." The crowd was stunned. Some shook their heads. Others murmured uneasily. And a few, the angriest and most desperate, looked at me with something darker in their eyes. I stood, slow and deliberate, set down my coffee, and walked toward her. The crowd parted slightly, tension crackling in the air. "Barbara," I said evenly, my voice carrying without a bullhorn, "you've accused me for weeks, dug up my yard, photographed my property, slandered me at every opportunity. And what do you have to show for it? Nothing. Just words." "Because you've hidden it," she shrieked, voice cracking. "You've fooled them, but I see you for what you are." I let the silence stretch, then turned to the crowd. "If anyone here has proof, real proof, that I've done anything, now's the time to show it." Of course, no one did. The silence was damning. The few who had eyed me suspiciously now looked away, embarrassed. Barbara's face twisted with rage, realizing she had overplayed her hand again. "You'll regret this," she spat, voice trembling. "You think you've won, but you haven't." She stormed off, bullhorn clattering against her leg, leaving the crowd muttering about her insanity. That night, I made my boldest move yet. I turned the valve fully on, and left it. Water surged through every pipe, every faucet, every sprinkler. The neighborhood roared back to life in a chorus of gushing taps and hissing hoses. Relief swept through the cul-de-sac like a cool breeze. Neighbors cheered, hugged, laughed. The crisis, as far as they knew, was finally over. But Barbara wasn't celebrating. From my porch, I saw her standing on her lawn, arms crossed, face pale in the moonlight. Because she knew what the others didn't. This wasn't the city fixing a main. This was me making a decision. And that meant I could make another decision any time I wanted. The balance of power had shifted entirely. Barbara no longer ruled with bylaws or fines. I ruled with silence and flow. And she knew it. Every glass of water, every shower, every sprinkler was a reminder that I held the valve, even if they couldn't prove it. The next morning, I found her bullhorn lying in the gutter, dented and abandoned. A symbol of her defeat. Picked it up, turned it over in my hands, then set it on my porch like a trophy. But even trophies gathered dust. And I wasn't finished yet. Barbara had poisoned my hedge, stolen my peace, tried to destroy me with petty power. Restoring the water wasn't mercy, it was the setup for the final act. The lesson wasn't complete until Barbara herself was undone, not just dethroned, not just humiliated, but stripped of every ounce of control she thought she had. And as I watched her from my porch, shoulders slumped, eyes darting nervously toward my yard, I knew exactly how to finish it. The hedge was gone. But the roots of revenge were still alive, deep and strong. The neighborhood should have been relieved once the water flowed freely again. And for a short while they were. People washed cars with theatrical joy, kids splashed in sprinklers, mothers posted triumphant photos of clean laundry on the group chat. It was like a victory parade. But beneath the laughter ran an undercurrent of unease. Because everyone knew the water hadn't returned because of Barbara, or the city, or even luck. It had returned because I allowed it. They couldn't prove it, but they felt it. And Barbara, she knew it like a bone-deep certainty. 4 days she lingered on her porch, staring across the cul-de-sac at me like a general watching her conqueror from the ruins of her own fort. She no longer shouted accusations. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than her bullhorn had ever been. Neighbors avoided her, embarrassed by the way she twitched at the sound of running water, flinched when sprinklers hissed to life. They whispered that she was unstable, paranoid, broken. And she was, but also dangerous. One Thursday evening, as I carried groceries inside, I noticed her car idling at the end of the street. She sat behind the wheel, unmoving, eyes fixed on my driveway. I raised a hand in a casual wave. She peeled out so fast her tires squealed against the asphalt. It would have been funny if it weren't so clearly a prelude to something worse. The escalation came 2 nights later. Just after midnight, a loud metallic bang rattled through the quiet. I bolted upright, slipped to the window, and saw Barbara and her husband by my back fence with a crowbar. They weren't digging this time, they were prying at the boards, trying to force their way in. My first instinct was to storm out, catch them red-handed. But then I remembered, patience wins wars. Instead, I grabbed my phone and filmed silently through the blinds as they wrestled with the wood. They didn't know I'd reinforced the fence posts with rebar years earlier. After 15 minutes of grunting and cursing, they gave up, stumbling off into the night defeated. The next morning, I made sure the footage found its way into the neighborhood group chat. I didn't even post it myself. Carl did, grinning like a child when he showed me on his phone. The caption read simply, "Caught red-handed. Who's the criminal now?" The explosion was immediate. Residents flooded the chat with outrage. Trespassing was one thing, but attempted break-ins? Barbara tried to defend herself, claiming she was investigating a suspected water theft. But the video made her look deranged, creeping around with a crowbar like a burglar. Any last shred of credibility she clung to evaporated. By afternoon, the police had been called. Not by me, but by a neighbor fed up with her antics. An officer visited her house, had a quiet but firm conversation, and left with Barbara red-faced and trembling. Rumor spread that she'd been issued a formal warning. And yet, even cornered, she refused to surrender. That evening, as the sun dipped low, she marched across the cul-de-sac and planted herself at the edge of my driveway. Her voice shook but carried. "You've won," she said, too loud for it to be private. "You've ruined me. But I swear, you will not get the last word." I leaned against the hood of my car, arms crossed. "Barbara," I said evenly, "you lost the last word weeks ago. You just haven't realized it yet." She stood there, vibrating with fury, until finally she spat at the ground and stormed away. The neighbors who had gathered at their windows shook their heads in unison. It was over, at least in their eyes. But I knew better. Barbara's kind doesn't fade quietly. 2 days later, I learned just how far she was willing to go. Carl knocked on my door at dawn, pale and wide-eyed, holding a letter. It had been slipped into his mailbox but clearly meant for me. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting jagged. The note inside read, "If you don't stop, people will get hurt. Accidents happen. Fires happen. Think about it." A threat. Thinly veiled, but unmistakable. Carl urged me to call the police, but I shook my head. Going to the cops would only drag me into the mud with her. Besides, I preferred to fight my battles my way. So I did something Barbara never expected. That evening, at dusk, I turned the valve off completely. For the first time in nearly a week, the cul-de-sac went dry again. Faucets sputtered, showers gasped, sprinklers died mid-arc. The cries of outrage began within minutes. But this time, I didn't turn it back on. Not after 3 hours, not after a day. For 72 straight hours, the neighborhood was bone dry. The chaos was immediate and glorious. Neighbors lined up at the park spigot again. Someone rigged a rain barrel to their gutter and bragged about independence. Families argued in their yards. But most importantly, the suspicion no longer circled me, it circled Barbara. After all, who had been caught prowling with a crowbar? Who had been publicly shamed and dethroned? Who had screamed loudest about sabotage? The mob turned. Angry knocks rattled her door. Shouts echoed down the street. "You're the reason we're suffering. What else are you hiding? Give us our money back." Barbara shouted back through the curtains, but the crowd wasn't listening anymore. They wanted a villain, and she had volunteered for the role. On the 4th morning, I restored the water at full blast. The relief was instantaneous, neighbors cheering, children laughing under hoses, mothers blessing the miracle. But not one of them thanked Barbara. They ignored her porch entirely, their joy pointedly excluding her. In their minds, she was now the enemy. I sat on my porch, mug in hand, watching the shift. My revenge was almost complete. But almost wasn't enough. Barbara had poisoned my hedge, tried to poison my reputation, even threatened violence. Ending her reign wasn't sufficient. She needed to be buried beneath the weight of her own actions, crushed so thoroughly she could never rise again. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A week later, Barbara tried to claw her way back with one final stunt. She hosted a community barbecue, free food on her lawn, an attempt to buy back goodwill. She set up folding tables, hired a catering truck, even rented a bounce house for the kids. On the surface, it looked generous. But the whispers began immediately. With what money? When the bill arrived, delivered in a single envelope from the catering company, neighbors discovered she had charged the entire event to the HOA account she no longer controlled. Nearly $5,000 stolen in plain sight. The outrage was volcanic. Residents stormed her lawn mid-event, yelling, waving the bill in her face while half-eaten hot dogs and paper plates littered the grass. Children were yanked from the bounce house, the catering truck packed up in haste. Barbara stood frozen, her generosity curdling into evidence of theft. The police were called again, this time by multiple neighbors. And this time, they didn't leave with just a warning. Barbara was led away in handcuffs, her face pale and tight, her husband shouting useless protests as the crowd watched in grim silence. From my porch, I raised my mug in salute once more. The hedge was gone, but my victory was complete. Barbara's kingdom was dust. Her power was stripped, her reputation ruined, her freedom in question. And all of it, every step, had been her own doing. All I had done was open and close a valve, and watch her drown on dry land. But as the police car pulled away, a strange thought crept into my mind. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control. I had discovered how intoxicating it was to hold a neighborhood by the throat with nothing more than a twist of the wrist. Barbara had been the first lesson. The HOA had been the first battlefield. And suddenly, I wondered, what else could be done with that kind of power? The war with Barbara was over. But something told me my game had only just begun. The neighborhood was quiet after Barbara's arrest, unnervingly so. For weeks the cul-de-sac had been alive with arguments, accusations, and chaos. Now it sat hushed, lawns brown and brittle, sprinklers hissing again with the faint triumph of restored water. People moved slower, spoke softer, as though the war had left them stunned. From my porch, mug in hand, I watched them rebuilding their routines, pretending nothing had happened. But silence has weight. It presses on you, reminding you that scars remain even when wounds close. Barbara was gone, but not forgotten. Her house sat dark most evenings, blinds drawn, husband skulking around like a man shrinking inside his own shadow. Rumor said she was out on bail, forbidden from HOA business, awaiting trial for misappropriation of funds. Some neighbors pitied her. Most didn't. They avoided her driveway like it was cursed ground. The queen had fallen, and the kingdom pretended she'd never ruled. For me, the victory should have been enough. The hedge was dead, yes, but I had avenged it 100-fold. Barbara's power was broken, her reputation shredded, her freedom dangling by a thread. And yet, I felt no closure. The truth was, the water valve still pulsed beneath my soil, humming with possibility. Every glass of water in the neighborhood was a quiet reminder that their comfort depended on my choice. They didn't know it, not fully, but they sensed it. I could see it in the way they glanced at me, too long, too cautious, unsure whether to thank me or fear me. One evening, Carl ambled over with 2 beers, his way of extending peace. He sat on my porch steps, handed me a bottle, and sighed. Hard to believe, huh? All that over a hedge and some pipes. Hard to believe they let her run the place so long, I replied. He nodded, sipping. Thing is, I don't think it's over. People are talking about forming a new board. Cleaner, fairer, more democratic. I chuckled. Democracy in a cul-de-sac. Sounds dangerous. Carl grinned. Maybe. But better than leaving things lawless. Otherwise, it's every man for himself. He gave me a sideways glance, the kind that pretends to be casual but carries weight. And we've all seen what happens when one man has too much control. I smiled, raised my bottle, and changed the subject. But his words lingered. They weren't a threat, just an observation. And he wasn't wrong. The longer I held the valve, the more I realized I wasn't just punishing Barbara. I was reshaping the neighborhood itself. The final act came unexpectedly. 2 weeks after Barbara's arrest, her husband held a yard sale. Furniture, knickknacks, framed inspirational quotes, all laid out like relics of a lost empire. The neighbors picked through them half-heartedly, muttering about bargains and karma. I stayed on my porch, watching. But as the sun dipped low, Barbara herself emerged. Not in handcuffs this time, but pale, drawn, and brittle. She stood by the folding table, eyes hollow, hair unkempt, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. The murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some turned away. Others whispered. A few bold ones sneered openly. Barbara tried to speak, tried to deliver one of her trademark speeches, but her voice cracked. You'll regret turning on me, she croaked. This community will fall apart without me. No one answered. They drifted away, leaving her standing alone in the wreckage of her yard sale, abandoned with her clipboard. It was the cruelest punishment of all irrelevance. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I walked over, calm and measured, and stopped a few feet from her. Barbara, I said, you poisoned my hedge because you wanted control. You wanted obedience. But all you did was expose how fragile your control really was. Her eyes flicked to mine, glassy and desperate. You think you're better than me? She whispered. I shook my head. No. Just smarter. I knew when to stop. And with that, I turned and walked away. Because the truth was, I had stopped. Days earlier, I'd locked the valve permanently open. No more games. No more control. The water flowed freely now, and would continue to, whether the neighbors knew it or not. I had already won. Barbara had been crushed not by my hand, but by her own greed, her own arrogance. My silence had simply given her room to implode. The hedge was gone, yes. But in its place, something else had grown, an understanding. Power isn't about bylaws or bullhorns or even water valves. It's about patience. About knowing when to push and when to stand still. About letting people reveal themselves. Barbara had revealed herself fully, and the neighborhood had turned on her without me ever needing to shout. In the weeks that followed, the cul-de-sac slowly healed. New families planted grass seed, children played in sprinklers again, barbecues returned to backyards. The HOA remained dissolved, replaced by informal neighborly cooperation. People waved more, argued less. For the first time, the street felt like a community, not a kingdom. And me? I replanted. Not the hedge, never the hedge. Instead, I built a small stone wall along the property line. Solid, permanent, untouchable. The neighbors admired it, nodded approvingly, even offered to help. No one mentioned the hedge. No one mentioned the war. It was as though the entire ordeal had been buried with Barbara's clipboard. But I knew better. I knew the story would live on in whispers, in the way neighbors glanced at me, in the way Barbara's house sat empty like a scar on the cul-de-sac. And every morning, when I sipped my coffee on the porch, I smiled at the memory of a hedge that had died so that something far greater could be born. In the end, revenge hadn't been about the water or the hedge. It had been about balance, about showing that control, once abused, always comes with a cost. Barbara had paid hers in full. And me? I was content. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. Sometimes the best revenge is silence, patience, and the knowledge that when the time came, I didn't just cut off their water supply. I cut off their queen.